June 10th, 1912, 2 a.m., 508 East 2nd Street, Villisca, Iowa. Inside a small wooden house, 8 people are sleeping. A father, a mother, 4 children, and 2 girls who had come over for a sleepover after church. In the darkness, someone walks up the stairs carrying an axe. Room by room, bed by bed, the axe comes down. 8 people, 8 victims, all killed while they slept. Here's what makes it impossible to understand. This was a wooden house with thin walls in a quiet town. The neighbors were close enough to hear conversations through open windows, but nobody heard the screams. Because there were no screams. Nobody woke up. Nobody ran. Nobody fought back. Every victim was found in their bed, face down, as if they'd never known what was happening. When the killer finished, he didn't run. He stayed in the house for hours. He covered the mirrors with cloth. He ate food from the kitchen. He locked the doors from the inside. And when morning came, the entire town discovered what had happened in that silent house. The case has never been solved. More than a century later, nobody knows for certain who held the axe that night. But the house still stands, preserved exactly as it was in 1912. You can pay to sleep there. The small town. In the early 1900s, Villisca, Iowa was everything people imagine when they think of small-town America. Population, just over 2,000. 1 main street. A church on every corner. Children riding bicycles in the middle of the road without fear. The kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. Where everyone knew everyone. Where the worst crime was usually someone's cow getting loose. The house at 508 East 2nd Street sat on a quiet corner with a white picket fence and a barn out back. From the outside, it looked like every other modest 2-story home in town. Wood siding, a small porch, windows that caught the morning sun. Nothing about it suggested it would become one of the most infamous murder houses in American history. The Moore family. Josiah B. Moore, 43 years old, was a well-respected businessman in Villisca. He managed the John Deere store in town and was known as hardworking, devout, and involved in the community. People trusted him. They did business with him. They sat next to him in church. His wife, Sarah Moore, 39, was active in the Presbyterian church. She sang in the choir, taught Sunday school, and organized community events. Their children were Herman, 11 years old Katherine, 10 Boyd, 7 Paul, 5 4 kids who went to school, played in the yard, and were part of the fabric of that small Iowa town. By all accounts, they were an ordinary family. Not rich, not poor. Just people living a quiet life in a quiet place. The last day Sunday, June 9th, 1912. The Moore family spent the day at church, as they did every Sunday. That evening, there was a special event at the Presbyterian church, a Children's Day program where kids recited verses, sang hymns, and performed for their families. The Moore children participated. Their parents sat in the pews, proud and attentive. Also at the church that night were 2 young sisters, Lena Stillinger, 12, and Ina Stillinger, 8. After the program ended, the Moore children invited the Stillinger girls to come sleep over at their house. It was a treat, a chance to stay up late and giggle before school started again Monday morning. The girls' parents agreed. It was Villisca. What could possibly go wrong? Around 9:45 p.m., the Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls left the church and walked the few blocks home through the warm June night. Neighbors later remembered seeing them walk past. A family of 6 and 2 extra children, all in their Sunday clothes, heading home under the dim glow of the streetlights. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. Inside the house. The family arrived home sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m. The children changed out of their church clothes. The Stillinger girls were given a bedroom downstairs, a small room just off the parlor, with 2 beds pushed close together. Upstairs, the 4 Moore children settled into their shared bedroom. Their parents went to their own room at the top of the stairs. By 10:30 or 11 p.m., the lights in the house went out. 8 people went to sleep. Somewhere in the darkness outside, someone was watching. The killer enters. No one knows the exact time the killer entered the house. Investigators later estimated it was sometime after midnight, probably between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m. on June 10th. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. That means one of 2 things. Either the door was unlocked, common in small towns like Villisca in 1912, or the killer had a key. Once inside, the killer didn't go straight upstairs. He went to the barn out back and retrieved the axe the Moore family used for chopping wood. He brought it inside. He tested its weight. He moved through the darkened house with unsettling familiarity. Then he climbed the stairs. The massacre begins. The killer went to Josiah and Sarah Moore's bedroom first. Investigators would later determine that Josiah was struck first while lying on his right side, facing the wall. The blows came down with such force that they left marks on the ceiling above the bed. Sarah Moore was struck next. She may have woken up and tried to turn toward her husband, but she never made it out of bed. Both were killed in seconds. Then the killer moved to the children's room. Herman, Katherine, Boyd, and Paul were all sleeping in two beds pushed together. The killer moved from one bed to the other, striking each child multiple times. None of them had time to scream. None of them had time to run. Finally, the killer went downstairs to the room where Lena and Ina Stillinger were sleeping. Lena, 12 years old, may have woken up. Some investigators believe she tried to defend herself. Her arms showed defensive wounds, and there were signs she may have tried to move. But she didn't make it out of the room. Ina, just 8 years old, was killed in her bed. 8 people, 8 victims, all within an hour. And somehow, impossibly, the house remained silent. What the killer did next. This is where the Villisca case becomes even more disturbing. After killing 8 people, the killer didn't run. He stayed in the house. Investigators who examined the scene the next day found evidence that the killer had covered the faces of most of the victims with bedsheets or clothing, draped fabric over every mirror in the house, washed the axe and left it leaning against the wall in the downstairs bedroom, possibly eaten food in the kitchen. The covering of the mirrors disturbed everyone who heard about it. In many cultures, covering mirrors is associated with death and mourning, a way to prevent the soul of the deceased from being trapped in the reflection. But these weren't mourners. This was the killer. Why did he do it? Was it shame? Superstition? Did he not want to see his own reflection after what he'd done? No one has ever answered that question. The locked doors. Before leaving, the killer locked the doors. From the inside, he left through one door and secured it behind him, disappearing into the June darkness. Inside the house, silence. 8 bodies, an axe, covered mirrors, and outside, the town of Villisca slept on, unaware. Monday morning. The next morning, Monday, June 10th, started like any other. The sun rose. The milkman made his rounds. The train whistle echoed through town. But at 508 East 2nd Street, something was wrong. Mary Peckham, the Moore family's neighbor, noticed that the house was unusually quiet. Normally by 7 or 8 a.m., she could hear the children playing in the yard or see Sarah hanging laundry on the line. But this morning, there was nothing. The curtains were still drawn. The doors were closed. No smoke came from the chimney. Mary waited. She assumed the family had slept in after the late church event. But as the morning dragged on and the house remained silent, she became worried. She walked over and knocked on the door. No answer. She called out. Silence. Growing alarmed, she went to get Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, who lived nearby. Ross came over with a key. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was how still everything was, how dark. He called out for his brother, for Sarah, for the children. Nothing. He walked through the parlor, toward the stairs, and that's when he saw the first signs that something was terribly wrong. He climbed the stairs slowly. At the top, he reached Josiah and Sarah's bedroom. He opened the door. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The scene Ross Moore stumbled back down the stairs, ran outside, and told Mary Peckham to call the police. Within minutes, the Villisca marshal and local authorities arrived. What they found inside was one of the most brutal crime scenes in American history. All 8 victims were still in their beds. All had been struck repeatedly with the axe, far more times than necessary to kill them. Josiah Moore had been struck so many times that his eyes were completely missing, driven into his skull by the force of the blows. The children showed similar injuries. Some had been struck more than a dozen times each. It wasn't just murder, it was overkill, rage, hatred, or madness. The Town Reacts news of the murders spread through Villisca like wildfire. Within hours, hundreds of people had gathered outside the house. Some were grieving, some were curious, some were terrified. The entire town shut down. Businesses closed, schools canceled classes. On June 12th, a mass funeral was held in the town square. Thousands attended, nearly the entire population of Villisca, plus people from surrounding towns. 6 white caskets, 2 smaller ones for the Stillinger girls. The grief was overwhelming. The fear was worse, because whoever had done this was still out there, and nobody had any idea who it was. A contaminated scene. The Villisca police did their best, but they were small-town law enforcement dealing with a crime scene beyond anything they'd ever encountered. Worse, within hours of the discovery, the house had been trampled by dozens of people, neighbors, curiosity seekers, even reporters. Evidence was destroyed. Fingerprints were smudged. Potential clues were lost forever. By the time trained investigators arrived from Des Moines and Omaha, the scene was hopelessly contaminated. Still, some facts were clear. The axe used in the murders belonged to the Moore family. It had been taken from their barn. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The killer had stayed in the house after the murders, possibly for hours. The unanswered question. And then there was the silence. How had 8 people been murdered in a wooden house with thin walls, on a quiet street, in a small town, and nobody heard anything? Investigators interviewed every neighbor within earshot. None of them reported hearing screams, shouts, or unusual sounds that night. The Moore's house was close to other homes. The windows were open because it was June. Sound traveled easily in that neighborhood, and yet, somehow, the massacre happened in complete silence. Some theories emerged. Maybe the killer struck so quickly that the victims never had time to scream. Maybe the first blows were delivered with such force that the victims were incapacitated instantly. Maybe fear paralyzed them. But none of those theories fully explained how 8 people could be killed without a single sound escaping that house. It was impossible, and yet it happened. Just like Amityville, 62 years later, Villisca would become a case defined by a silence that defied all logic. A town tears itself apart. In the days following the murders, Villisca became a town consumed by suspicion and fear. People locked their doors for the first time in their lives. Neighbors eyed each other with distrust. Strangers passing through town were interrogated. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a suspect in mind. The problem was, there were too many suspects, and not enough evidence to convict any of them. Suspect number 1, Frank F. Jones. The first person investigators focused on was Frank F. Jones, a wealthy businessman and Iowa state senator. Jones had once been Josiah Moore's employer and business partner, but the two had a bitter falling out years before the murders. Moore left Jones's company and started competing against him, taking clients, undercutting prices, and building a successful business of his own. Jones never forgave him. There were rumors around town that Jones had threatened Moore, that he'd said publicly he would get even one day. And there was something else. Jones had been having an affair with a local woman, and some people whispered that Sarah Moore knew about it and had threatened to expose him. Motive, revenge, business rivalry, fear of scandal. But Jones had an alibi. He claimed he was out of town the night of the murders. And despite years of suspicion, no physical evidence ever linked him to the crime scene. Still, many in Villisca believed, until the day they died, that Frank Jones was behind it. Not that he swung the axe himself, but that he'd paid someone to do it. Suspect number 2, William Blackie Mansfield. The second major suspect was a man named William Mansfield, also known as Blackie because of his dark complexion. Mansfield was a drifter, a criminal, and, according to some investigators, a killer for hire. In 1914, 2 years after the Villisca murders, Mansfield was arrested for the axe murders of his wife, her parents, and his infant child in Blue Island, Illinois. The similarities to Villisca were chilling. Entire family killed with an axe while sleeping. Faces covered with cloth. Killer stayed in the house afterward. Victims showed signs of overkill. Far more blows than necessary. Investigators began to wonder. Had Mansfield been in Iowa in June 1912? There was circumstantial evidence suggesting he might have been. Some witnesses claimed to have seen a man matching his description near Villisca around the time of the murders. And there was one more detail that made people's blood run cold. Frank F. Jones, the businessman with the grudge against Josiah Moore, knew William Mansfield. The theory: Jones hired Mansfield to kill the Moore family. But again, there was no hard evidence, no confession, no physical proof tying Mansfield to Villisca. He was convicted of the Illinois murders and died in prison in 1915, never having been charged with the Villisca crime. Suspect number 3, Reverend George Kelly. The third, and perhaps most disturbing suspect, was a traveling preacher named Reverend George Jacqueline Kelly. Kelly was a known religious fanatic who traveled from town to town giving sermons. He had been in Villisca the night of the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, the same event the Moore family and Stillinger girls attended before going home. Witnesses said Kelly acted strangely that night. He lingered in the church after others left. He seemed agitated, nervous, talking to himself. And here's what made him a suspect. Kelly later confessed, multiple times, to the Villisca murders. But there was a problem. Kelly confessed to a lot of murders. He was mentally unstable, possibly schizophrenic, and had a habit of confessing to crimes he didn't commit. His confessions were inconsistent, filled with details that didn't match the crime scene, and often retracted shortly after. Still, authorities arrested him in 1917 and put him on trial. The trial was a circus. Kelly rambled. He claimed God had told him to kill the Moores. Then he recanted. Then he confessed again. The jury deadlocked. A second trial was ordered, but Kelly was eventually acquitted due to lack of physical evidence. He died in 1954, still insisting on and off that he'd done it, but nobody knew if he was telling the truth or living in a delusional fantasy. The others. There were other suspects over the years. A man named Andy Sawyer, seen near the house the night of the murders. Henry Moore, a relative of Josiah's who some believed had a grudge. Unidentified transients who passed through town that week. Every lead went cold. Every theory fell apart under scrutiny. By the 1920s, the case was effectively closed, unsolved, unresolved, and buried under a century of speculation. Abandoned and cursed. After the murders, nobody wanted to live in the house at 508 East 2nd Street. It sat empty for years. Occasionally, someone would try to rent it or buy it cheap, but they never stayed long. Some claimed they heard noises at night. Others said they felt watched. Most just couldn't stand the weight of what had happened there. By the 1940s and 50s, the house had fallen into serious disrepair. Paint peeled, floorboards rotted, windows broke. Villisca wanted to forget. The town had tried to move on, but the house remained, silent, decaying, a monument to a tragedy no one could explain. The restoration. In 1994, a man named Darwin Lynn and his wife Martha bought the house. Their goal wasn't to live in it, it was to restore it. They spent years researching what the house looked like in 1912, studying old photographs, interviewing descendants of the Moore family, tracking down period-accurate furniture and wallpaper. Slowly, painstakingly, they brought the house back. The same beds where the victims died were recreated and placed in the exact positions they'd been in that night. The same layout, the same colors, the same eerie, frozen-in-time feeling. By the early 2000s, the Villisca Axe murder house looked exactly as it had on June 9, 1912, the night before 8 people were killed. And then the Lynns opened it to the public, tours, tourists, and paranormal investigators. Today, the Villisca Axe murder house is one of the most visited haunted attractions in the Midwest. You can take a daytime tour for about $10. A guide walks you through the house, room by room, describing in detail where each victim was found, how they were killed, and what the killer did afterward. Children stand in the bedroom where the Moore children died. Tourists take selfies in the room where Lena and Ina Stillinger were murdered. Some people giggle, some cry, some leave feeling sick. But here's where it gets even stranger. For $428 per night, you can rent the entire house and sleep there overnight. The website markets it as a paranormal investigation experience. Groups of ghost hunters, YouTubers, and thrill seekers book months in advance to spend the night in the rooms where 8 people were brutally murdered. They bring EVP recorders, infrared cameras, Ouija boards. They sit in the dark and ask questions. Is anyone here? Did you suffer? Who killed you? Some claim they've captured voices on tape. Others say they've seen shadows moving in the hallway. A few have left in the middle of the night, too terrified to stay. The house has been featured on dozens of paranormal TV shows. Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, Paranormal Lockdown. Each one tells the story of the murders. Each one promises to find evidence of ghosts. But here's what none of them talk about. The real victims, the real grief, The real horror of what happened. Who were they? Let's take a moment to remember the 8 people who died at 508 East 2nd Street. Not as ghosts, not as paranormal entities, but as human beings. Josiah B. Moore, 43 years old, a father who worked hard to provide for his family. A man with flaws, yes, business rivalries, a temper, but a man who went to church every Sunday and tried to raise his kids right. Sarah Moore, 39 years old, a mother who sang in the choir, taught Sunday school, and filled her home with love and structure. She tucked her children into bed that night, not knowing it would be the last time. Herman Moore, 11 years old, a boy who liked to play outside, who had friends at school, who had a whole life ahead of him. Katherine Moore, 10 years old, a little girl who performed at the Children's Day program hours before she died. Boyd Moore, 7 years old. Paul Moore, 5 years old, the baby of the family. And then there were the guests. Lena Stillinger, 12 years old, a girl who'd been invited to a sleepover by her friends. She was supposed to go home the next morning. Instead, she died in a stranger's house, far from her own bed, possibly the only one who woke up and tried to fight. Ina Stillinger, 8 years old, a child who trusted the world, who believed she was safe. These were real people. They had favorite foods, they had inside jokes, they had dreams, and they were taken in the most brutal, senseless way imaginable. The tragedy no one talks about. But when people visit the house today, they don't talk about Josiah's work ethic or Sarah's kindness. They talk about orbs, about cold spots, about whether they felt a presence. The 8 people who died there have been reduced to background characters in their own story. The house is the star now, the legend, the brand, and that's the real horror. Why didn't anyone wake up? More than 110 years later, the question still haunts investigators. How did this happen in silence? Modern forensic psychologists and criminologists have studied the case and offered theories. Theory 1, blitz attack on parents first. The killer struck Josiah and Sarah Moore first, with such speed and violence that they never had time to scream. By eliminating the adults immediately, the killer ensured no one could protect the children or raise an alarm. Theory 2, the axe itself. An axe blow to the head can cause instant unconsciousness or death. If the first strike was precise and powerful enough, the victims may have been incapacitated before their brains could process what was happening. Theory 3, deep sleep. After a long day. The family had spent the entire day at church and the evening at the Children's Day program. They were exhausted. Deep sleep, especially in children, can make it harder to wake, even to loud noises. But none of these theories explain everything. Why didn't the neighbors hear the axe striking wood and bone? Why didn't any of the children scream as they watched the killer move through the room? Why was there no sign of anyone trying to run, to hide, to escape? The silence of Villisca, like the silence of Amityville 62 years later, defies complete explanation. Who did it? The most likely scenario, based on the evidence, is this. Frank F. Jones, the wealthy businessman with a grudge against Josiah Moore, hired William Mansfield to kill the family. Mansfield had motive, money, means, he was a known killer, and opportunity. He may have been in the area. The crime bears his signature: axe murders, overkill, faces covered, staying in the house afterward. But we'll never know for sure. Mansfield died in prison in 1915 without confessing. Jones died in 1926, never charged. Reverend Kelly died in obscurity. The case will remain, forever, unsolved. What Villisca became today, Villisca, Iowa, is a town of about 1,200 people, smaller than it was in 1912. The main street is quiet. The church where the Moore family attended that last Sunday still stands. And the house at 508 East 2nd Street, it's the most famous thing about the town. Thousands of people visit every year. Some come for the history, some come for the thrill. Some come hoping to see a ghost, but very few come to mourn. Very few come to remember 8 real people whose lives were stolen in one terrible night. Instead, Villisca has become a brand, a destination, a haunted house attraction. And the victims? They've been forgotten in favor of the legend. The question we should be asking. The real horror of Villisca isn't paranormal. It's human. It's a man, or men, who walked into a house and killed 8 innocent people, including 6 children, for reasons we may never fully understand. It's a justice system that failed to convict anyone, leaving a community without closure and victims without justice. It's a society that turned a crime scene into a tourist attraction, where people pay to sleep in the beds where children were murdered. And it's the fact that, more than a century later, we're more interested in ghost stories than we are in the truth. The house today, 508 East 2nd Street, Villisca, Iowa. The house is still there, still preserved, still open for tours and overnight stays. On summer evenings, you can see groups of people walking up to the front porch with flashlights and cameras, excited to spend the night in the most haunted house in Iowa. They laugh. They dare each other to go into the children's room alone. They post videos on YouTube with titles like "We Stayed in the Murder House, 3 a.m. Challenge." And somewhere, buried in a cemetery not far from that house, are 8 graves. Josiah and Sarah Moore, Herman, Katherine, Boyd, and Paul, Lena and Ina Stillinger. People don't visit those graves much anymore, but they'll pay $428 to sleep in the house where they died. The lesson we refuse to learn. Villisca, like Amityville, teaches us something uncomfortable about ourselves. We would rather believe in ghosts than confront the real monsters. We would rather be entertained by tragedy than sit with the grief of it. We would rather turn victims into legends than remember them as people. The silence that filled the house on June 10, 1912 was horrifying. But the silence we've chosen since, the silence about justice, about exploitation, about the humanity of the victims, is worse. Because that silence is a choice, and we keep choosing it. In memory of Josiah B. Moore, 43, Sarah Moore, 39, Herman Moore, 11, Katherine Moore, 10, Boyd Moore, 7, Paul Moore, 5, Lena Stillinger, 12, Ina Stillinger, 8, murdered June 10, 1912. Justice never served, never forgotten.